The phone rang at 11:47 on a Friday night. The moment I answered, my 8-year-old granddaughter sobbed, "Grandma, Mom is gone." She said her father wasn't panicking. He was too calm, as if he had been waiting for this to happen. My blood ran cold. I called my younger sister, and before sunrise, we were on the road. I found my daughter deep in an abandoned forest, barely breathing. And as I held her in my arms, I knew one thing clearly: whoever did this had just made their final mistake. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from your country? Your city, I genuinely want to know. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but everything it means to say it means. The phone rang at 11:47 on a Friday night, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong you brush off and forget by morning. The kind that settles into your chest like cold groundwater and stays there. I had been asleep for maybe 2 hours, which was about as much as I ever got these days. The cabin was quiet the way mountain cabins get quiet in September. Not peaceful, just empty. Rain tapping the tin roof, wind moving slow through the hickory trees out back. I'd gotten used to that kind of silence after Thayer and I separated 3 years ago. Some nights I even told myself I liked it. Then the phone lit up on the nightstand. Junie Vale. I sat up. An 8-year-old does not call her grandmother at 11:47 at night because everything is fine. I answered before the second ring. "Junie, hey, I'm here." Her voice came through small and careful, the way kids sound when they've been crying for a while and are trying hard not to show it. "Grandma Z." A pause. "Did I wake you up?" "No, baby, talk to me. What's going on?" I heard her breathe in, slow, like she was measuring something. Outside, the rain picked up against the window glass. "Mama's gone," she said. I kept my voice even. "Gone how? Daddy said she needed some time alone. Said she went to stay somewhere quiet for a few days." Another pause, shorter this time. "That was Monday, Grandma Z. It's Friday." 5 days. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there in the dark, the floorboards cool under my feet. I had known Elowen since she was 8 years old, the same age Junie was now. I had watched her grow up with her jaw set against me, her eyes carrying something I never quite figured out how to reach. We hadn't spoken more than a handful of times in the past 2 years. That was just the shape of things between us had been for a long time. But Elowen was a mother. Whatever distance she kept from the rest of the world, she did not keep it from her daughter. "Has she called?" I asked. "Daddy showed me a voice message. Said it was from Mama." Junie stopped. It sounded like her voice. But the silence that followed was only a few seconds long. It felt longer. "She didn't say goodnight, moonlight bug." Junie's voice cracked on the last word just barely. "She always says that Grandma Z, every single night, even when she was traveling. She never forgets. Not once." I pressed my free hand flat against my knee. "Good night, moonlight bug." I didn't know that phrase. Didn't matter. What mattered was that Junie knew. It knew it the way children know the exact weight of their mother's hand on their back, the specific sound of her laugh, the words she uses, and the ones she never would. Someone had recorded a message using Elowen's voice, and that someone had not done their homework. "Junie," I said carefully, "that voice message, does it sound exactly like your mama?" I heard her think about it. 3 full seconds. "It sounds like her," she said, "but it doesn't feel like her." I stood up from the bed. 52 years of living in these mountains had taught me a particular kind of patience, the patience of a woman who'd spent decades reading weather patterns and animal tracks, and the way a trail can tell you everything about who walked it last. I had learned early that the loudest things in the forest are rarely the ones you need to worry about. It's the silence underneath the silence that means something's coming. Everything in me went very still. Elowen did not go anywhere voluntarily and leave her daughter 5 days without a real good night. "Junie, listen to me." I kept my voice low and steady, the way I'd learned to talk to frightened animals and frightened people. "You did the right thing calling me. I need you to go back to your room, lock your door, and try to sleep. Can you do that? Is Mama okay?" The honest answer was, I don't know. The true answer was something darker. "I'm going to find out," I said. "That's a promise." After we hung up, I stood at the window for a long moment. The rain had softened to a mist. Down below the ridge, the tree line was nothing but black shapes against a darker black, the way this mountain looked on every night I'd stood here alone and tried to convince myself solitude was enough. I picked up the phone again, not to call the police, not yet. Not to call Thayer, who would hedge and delay and find 17 reasons why everything was probably fine. I called the one person who would hear what I said and move without asking unnecessary questions. My younger sister, Nyla, answered on the second ring. "It's late," she said not unkindly. "I know." I watched the dark tree line and felt the thing settling deeper into my chest, that cold, certain knowing. "I need you to come to Asheville with me. Tonight, if you can." A beat of silence. Then, "Tell me on the drive." Neela had barely said 10 words the whole drive down from Harlan County, which told me everything about how worried she was. My sister was not a quiet woman by nature. We reached Asheville before 4 in the morning and sat in the truck on a side street 3 blocks from the house, waiting for an hour that wouldn't look like an ambush. At 2 minutes past 7, we pulled up to the house. I had seen photographs of where Elowen lived. Junie had sent me a few over the years, birthday parties and holiday decorations on the front porch. But photographs did not prepare you for the sheer deliberateness of the place. Every shrub trimmed to the same height, every window with the same style of curtain pulled to precisely the same position. The kind of house that looked less like a home and more like a statement someone was trying very hard to make. I knocked. Nyla stood 1 step behind me, arms crossed, jaw set. The door opened in under 30 seconds. Lucian Vale was dressed in a pressed white Oxford shirt, dark slacks, and leather shoes that had no business being worn at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. He was holding a coffee mug in his right hand like a prop, and he was smiling warm, unhurried, not a single muscle in his face, registering surprise at finding 2 women on his doorstep before sunrise. That smile made my stomach turn. "Zoraya." His voice was smooth as Riverstone. "I didn't know you were coming down. Please come in." He stepped aside before I could answer, gesturing toward the hallway with the easy hospitality of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment. Inside the house smelled of fresh coffee and something else underneath it, something faint and chemical sweet in the wrong way. I had spent years as a ranger handling tranquilizers for injured wildlife. Ketamine midazolam compounds you learn to recognize by smell because dosing an animal wrong could kill it. My nose knew what my brain didn't want to confirm yet. I kept my face neutral and looked around. The kitchen security camera in the corner above the refrigerator had a strip of black electrical tape across its lens. Not broken, covered. Deliberately recently with the kind of care that meant someone wanted to make sure it stayed covered. My chest tightened, but I kept walking. The wall calendar beside the refrigerator was turned to September. The page for the previous week, the week Elowen disappeared, had been torn away. Not neatly. The ragged edge was still there, a pale strip of paper clinging to the spiral binding. Coffee. Lucian offered, already moving toward the counter. "No, thank you." I pulled my eyes away from the calendar. "Where's Junie?" "At my mother's." He set his mug down, turned to face me with that same easy expression. "Morel offered to take her for the weekend, give the house some quiet while Elowen's away." Too smooth, too fast. The answer came the way answers come when someone has been sitting with them for days, running them over and over, until they stopped sounding rehearsed and started sounding natural. My throat tightened with something that felt dangerously close to rage, but I pressed it back down. "I'd like to speak with Elowen," I said. "Of course." He picked up a phone from the counter, a phone in a plain black case, and tapped the screen twice. "She sent a voice message 2 days ago. Here." He held it out. I listened. The voice was Eloan's cadence, Eloan's phrasing. It said she needed time to herself, that she was doing fine, that Junie was in good hands. It lasted 43 seconds. It did not say "Goodnight, Moonlight Bug." But more than that, the lock screen on that phone was wrong. Eloan's phone had a photo of Junie at the Blue Ridge overlook a picture I had seen Junie send from her own tablet 2 summers ago. This screen was solid black, factory default. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. I handed the phone back without letting my hand shake. "That's not her phone," I said. Lucian's smile didn't waver by a single degree. "She left her regular one at home, took a spare. She wanted the break to be real, you know? No notifications, no. I'd like to speak to Eloan directly," I said, cutting clean through whatever else he had planned to say. "Not a recording, not a message. I want to hear her voice on a live call." He tilted his head, something shifting behind his eyes just for a fraction of a second, quick as a shadow crossing water. Then the smile came back warm and full and completely unreadable. "Of course," he said. "I'll have her call you." The words were perfect, reasonable, cooperative. Every syllable exactly what a concerned husband would say, and every syllable was a lie. I thanked him for his time. I kept my voice even and my shoulders straight, and I walked out of that house with my hands loose at my sides because the alternative was grabbing him by that pressed white collar and demanding to know where he had put my stepdaughter. Nyla looked at my face when I got back to the truck. Her eyes went sharp immediately. "How bad?" "Bad," I said. I put the key in the ignition. My hands, finally away from his gaze, were trembling faintly. Camera covered. Calendar torn. Something chemical in that living room, sedatives, I think. And that wasn't Eloan's phone. She sucked in a breath through her teeth. Zoraya. He planned this. My voice came out quieter than I intended, which meant I was angrier than I could afford to be right now. This wasn't a fight that got out of hand. He planned every piece of it. I pulled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, Lucian was still standing at the open front door, coffee mug in hand, watching our truck move down the street, not shifting his weight, not looking away, eyes steady and patient as a man who believed he had already won. He was still watching when we turned the corner and he disappeared from view. I had not set foot on this property in 3 years. Not since the morning I packed the last of my things into 2 duffel bags while Thayer sat at the kitchen table and watched me go coffee in hand, not saying a word. Some endings come with shouting and broken dishes. Ours came with the sound of a screen door closing softly behind me and the particular silence of a man who was relieved. His pickup truck was in the driveway, an old Ford F-150, same rust patch on the rear quarter panel I remembered. He was home. And when I knocked the 3-second pause before the door opened, told me he had seen my car pull up and spent those seconds deciding whether to answer. He answered. Of course he did. Thayer Mercer had never been brave enough to do the harder thing. Zoraya. He looked genuinely startled, which was the first dishonest thing he did. His hair had gone fully gray since I'd last seen him. He'd lost weight, not healthy weight, the kind that comes from bad sleep and worse decisions. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know you didn't." I stepped inside before he could decide not to invite me. "We need to talk about Eloan." The living room hit me like a fist I hadn't braced for. It was the same room I had spent 12 years of my life in, and it looked like someone had slowly stopped caring about it. Dishes on the coffee table, a stack of unopened mail on the armchair, the curtains half drawn at 2 p.m, and on the wall above the fireplace, still there, still in the same frame, a photograph of Isolde, Elian's mother, Thayer's first wife. She was laughing in the picture, caught mid-sentence at some backyard gathering her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She'd been 31 when that photo was taken. She never made it to 40. My throat tightened. I looked away. "Sit down, Thayer." He sat. He had his hands wrapped around each other in his lap, squeezing and releasing, a habit he'd always had when he was cornered. "I already talked to Lucienne this morning," I said. Don't tell me you don't know anything. Tell me what you actually know." "I don't know much." "Thayer." My voice came out flat and quiet, not angry, just done. "Your daughter has been gone for 5 days. Junie called me at midnight because nobody else was acting like that was a problem. So I need you to stop performing innocence and tell me what Lucian said to you before this happened." He flinched. His hands went still in his lap. And then piece by piece the story came out, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way guilt comes out when a person has been holding it too long and it's started to rot. Lucian had called him the week before, said Elowen was stressed that she'd been fixating on things that weren't her business, that she needed some time away to get her head straight. Thayer had asked if she was okay. Lucian had said yes. Thayer had not asked where she was going, how long she'd be gone, or whether Elowen herself had agreed to any of it. He said she just needed to calm down. Thayer said, his voice thin and reedy, "You know how she gets when she's anxious. You knew he was going to take her somewhere," I said. "And you didn't ask where." He opened his mouth, closed it. The skin around his eyes had gone red. "Morel called me too," he finally said, barely above a whisper. "A few days before. She said there were some financial matters that needed to get sorted out, said if things went smoothly, some of what I owe would be taken care of." The air in that room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. He owed money. Of course he did. And Morel Vale had made sure he understood that his silence had a price, and that price had already been paid. "So you sold her out," I said. "I didn't sell anyone I didn't know he was going to." His voice cracked, and his eyes went wet at the corners, and some part of me registered that he was genuinely distressed, that he had told himself a version of this story where he was not the villain, where he had simply stayed out of something that wasn't his business. Lucien just needed her to calm down about the trust, Zariah. That's all he said. I thought it would be a few days. He stopped. His hand flew up to cover his mouth like he could pull the word back in. Trust. I filed it away without showing anything on my face. 22 years ago, I said, and my voice came out steady, even though my chest was doing something that scared me, a slow, grinding ache like a joint that had been pushed wrong. "When Isolde died, you were afraid Elowen would love me more than she loved you, so you made sure she never would." Thayer's mouth opened. "Every time she looked at me and didn't see family, that was you, Thayer. Every time she flinched when I tried to help, every time she acted like I was some stranger in her house. You put that in her head, not because you hated me, because you were scared." My voice stayed level, but I could feel the heat rising up the back of my neck, the pressure behind my eyes. And now she's gone somewhere with a man who is not safe, and your silence helped put her there. He didn't deny it. That was the thing about Thayer. He could beg and deflect and justify all day long, but when the truth was laid out in front of him plainly enough, he went quiet. Not from dignity, from the simple weight of knowing he had no argument left. I turned and walked toward the door. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. A text from Nyla. "Come back toward the main road. Found something at the parking lot by Lucian's neighborhood. You need to see this." I stepped outside into the pale September light, pulling the door shut behind me. My hands were steady. My jaw was tight. And somewhere between the living room and the front step, I had made myself a promise I intended to keep. Whatever Thayer had let happen, I was going to undo it. I used to believe in that sign. To serve and protect. Blue letters on white hung above the entrance of every sheriff's office I had ever walked into. Growing up in the mountains, you learned to trust those words the way you trusted a trail marker. They told you where you were. They told you someone had been there before you and left something behind to help you find your way. Nyla was waiting for me at the corner of the parking lot when I pulled up. She was leaning against her truck with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way it got when she was working very hard not to say every single thing on her mind at once. My younger sister had never been built for restraint. "You saw the oil trail?" I asked, coming to stand beside her. "SUV," she said, her voice clipped and certain. "Rear axle leak driver's side. The drip pattern's too consistent to be random. Whoever was driving came through here at least twice in the past week." She pointed down the lot, following the faint dark line with one finger. "I've been tracking it since this morning. It goes north on Merriman Avenue before I lose it." I filed that away. North. "Tell me inside," I said. "We're going in." The Buncombe County Sheriff's Office smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. A deputy at the front desk pointed us toward a hallway without looking up from his computer. At the end of that hallway, behind a desk that was too clean for a man who actually worked, sat Sheriff Orson Pike. He was 59 years old, broad-shouldered with a full head of silver hair and the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of standing outside at community events and charity golf tournaments. He had the face of a man everyone's grandfather trusted. Warm eyes, easy smile, laugh lines that looked earned. He stood when we came in, extended his hand across the desk. "Ms. Mercer, come on in, ladies. Have a seat." His grip was firm and dry. His smile reached his eyes perfectly, and something at the base of my spine went cold. Beside me, Nyla pulled out a chair and sat down hard the way she sat when she was already 2 sentences ahead of the conversation and didn't like where it was going. I laid out everything clearly in order without embellishment. Alawan had been gone since Monday, 5 days. No direct contact with her daughter, a voice message that didn't match her patterns, a phone that wasn't hers, a husband who had answers that came too fast and fit too neatly. Orson listened with his full attention, nodding at the right moment's pen moving across his notepad. His expression was the picture of professional concern. When I finished, he looked down at what he'd written. "I'm going to classify this as a voluntary departure for now," he said, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. "Give us time to reach out through proper channels." Nyla's chair scraped back. She was on her feet before I could put a hand out. "Voluntary departure." Her voice hit the word like a hammer. Her 8-year-old daughter hasn't heard from her in 5 days, and you're writing it up as voluntary. Ms. Quinn, who told you about the mental health history? Nyla's eyes were blazing, her finger pointing at the notepad like she wanted to tear it in half. "Because we didn't say a word about that. So who called you before we walked in here?" Orson's smile didn't break. He folded his hands on the desk patient as a man who had sat through 100 uncomfortable conversations and walked out of every one of them just fine. Family members sometimes share background with us in advance. It helps us provide appropriate... "That is not an answer," Nyla said, her voice cracking with the effort of keeping it below a shout. I put my hand on her arm. She sat back down her chest, heaving her jaw, working like she was chewing through something she couldn't swallow. I looked at Orson. "There is no 72-hour waiting period for missing persons in North Carolina," I said. "Not in state law, not in federal guidelines. That rule doesn't exist. You can open a case right now today, and you know that." Something flickered across his face so fast I almost missed it. A recalibration. The smile stayed, but the warmth behind it cooled by exactly 1 degree. "You're right that there's no mandatory waiting period," he said smoothly, "but we do use discretion in how we allocate resources. Given the circumstances, I said, a 31-year-old woman with an 8-year-old child has not made voluntary contact in 5 days. Her daughter called me at midnight because she is frightened. That is your missing person." He wrote something on his notepad. I watched his pen move and felt my stomach drop because whatever he was writing, it was not what I had just said. His hand was too relaxed. He was filling in blanks he had already decided on before we arrived. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Deputy Kellen Voss had been standing near the filing cabinet since we walked in, young, dark-haired, about 39, with the posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. He hadn't said a word. But as Orson turned to reach for something on his credenza, Kellen stepped forward, set a single sheet of paper face down on the edge of the desk nearest to me, and stepped back. He did not look at me when he did it. His face was carefully blank, But his hand, the hand that set the paper down, had a faint tremor in the fingers there, and gone in a half-second. I slid the paper off the desk and into my lap without looking down. Orson turned back around. "We'll look into it, Ms. Mercer. Give it a day or two. I promise you, if there's cause for concern, we will act." Every word landed like a door closing. I stood. My legs felt steadier than they had any right to. Neela stood beside me, and I could feel the heat radiating off her. She was furious in the way only someone who loves deeply can be furious, the kind of anger that comes from watching the wrong people hold all the power. We walked out. The afternoon sun was sharp and low, throwing long shadows across the parking lot. As soon as the door fell shut behind us, Neela turned to me, her eyes wet at the corners, her voice dropping to something raw and tight. "He's been bought. You know that, right? That man has been bought." I looked back through the glass door. Orson was already on the phone, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. "Then we do this ourselves," I said. I looked down at the paper in my hand. It was a standard missing persons form, the correct one, the one with the proper federal classification fields. Blank, unfilled. But at the top, in small penciled letters that could have been written by anyone north on Merriman, "Check the ridge roads." Nyla had already walked 3 steps ahead. She stopped, turned, and pointed at the asphalt near the lot's edge, a dark, irregular line of oil drops leading away from us toward the street. "A SUV with a rear axle problem," she said, her voice steadying into something focused and hard. "I've been tracking this since this morning." The drive back to Harlan County took 3.5 hours, and I spent most of it with both hands on the wheel and my mind running in circles I couldn't stop. By the time I pulled up the gravel path to my cabin, the sky had gone fully dark, and the temperature had dropped the way it always did up here in September, quick and mean, like the mountain, reminding you it could take the warmth back whenever it wanted. I sat in the truck for a minute after I cut the engine. The trees pressed close on all sides. The wind moved through them in long, slow waves. I went inside and did not sleep. I made coffee I didn't drink. I spread Kellen's note and the oil-stained photographs Neela had taken on the kitchen table and looked at them until the lines blurred. North on Merriman, ridge roads, a SUV that had been up and down that route at least twice in the past week. It was almost 10 o'clock when I pulled the box out from under the bed. I hadn't opened it in over 3 years. It was cedar about the size of a shoebox with a small brass latch that had gone green at the edges. I had wrapped it in an old flannel shirt when I packed up my things at Thayer's house, and I had carried it with me the same way I carried everything I couldn't explain quietly without making a show of it, telling myself I would deal with it later. Later had apparently taken 3 years. The latch gave with a soft click, and the smell came up first, lavender faint and dry, the kind that clings to fabric for years after the sachet has long since crumbled. My throat closed around something I hadn't been prepared for. Isolde Harrow had been 38 years old when she died. I had only known her for about 14 months the last year of her life, when her illness had already started taking things from her in pieces. She'd been sharp and funny and fiercer than anyone gave her credit for, and she had loved her daughter with the particular intensity of a woman who knew she was running out of time to show it. We had not been close in the way people mean when they use that word, but we had understood each other. That was rarer in my experience. I lifted the items out one by one. A wedding dress folded in tissue paper, ivory gone slightly yellow at the hem. 3 letters in Isolde's handwriting, the envelope still sealed, addressed to Elowen, with dates written in pencil on the back 18th birthday, wedding day, when you need her most. My chest ached looking at them. Elowen had never asked for these, and I had never found a way to give them to her that she would have accepted. A cassette tape labeled E Summer Songs Age 4, a small watercolor painting of the Blue Ridge Amateur but Careful signed with a lowercase I in the corner, a journal dark green cover half filled, and underneath the journal, folded into quarters edges, soft with age, a map. It was a topographic map of the mountain ranges north of Asheville, the kind you could pick up at any ranger station, printed on heavy paper. but this one had been marked by hand in red pen, small circles notations in Isolde's tight, precise script. Most of them I recognized trailheads overlooks a creek crossing, the kind of notes a careful person made when they were learning a new territory. And then, in the upper left quadrant, one circle larger than the others, Linden Ridge. Beside it, in letters so small I had to hold the map close to the Lampthayer's old place. He thinks I don't know. My heart beat once very hard against my ribs. I set the map down and picked up the journal. I turned to the last written page, and then for the first time in the 3 years I had owned this box, I read it aloud. My own voice in the empty cabin felt strange, small, like something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. If anything happens to me, Zoraya will know what to do. She always does. Not because she's perfect, she'd be the first to tell you she isn't, but because she pays attention. She watches. She remembers. Alawan won't understand that yet. Maybe she won't for a long time, but I need someone to hold the map until she's ready to read it. I stopped reading. The wind outside pushed against the cabin walls, a low and steady pressure. The lamp on the nightstand threw a warm circle of light that didn't reach the corners of the room. Alawan had spent 22 years believing I had taken something from her, that I had stepped into her mother's place the way you replace a piece of furniture, same function, different face. She had looked at me and seen an intruder, and I had spent 2 decades accepting that as simply the shape of our relationship, something to be endured, not fixed. But Isolde had known. She had written it down in a green journal and folded a map into quarters and put them both in a cedar box with a brass latch, trusting that I would find them when it mattered. My phone buzzed on the table. Neela. The oil trail confirms it, she said without preamble. I cross-referenced the ridge roads on a county map. There's only one property up on Linden Ridge that's been in private hands long enough to fit. Unpaved access road, no utilities on record since 2009. Her voice was tight, controlled. Zoraya. That's where he took her. I looked down at the red circle on the map. Linden Ridge. I had walked that ridge for the first time when I was 14 years old, my father 3 steps ahead of me, teaching me how to read the land the way other fathers taught their kids to read books. I knew every drainage ditch, every false trail, every place the tree cover broke and gave you a sightline. Lucian Vale had put Elowen somewhere he thought no one would find her. He had not counted on Isolde leaving a map. He had not counted on me. I folded the map along its original creases, slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and pressed my hand flat against it for a moment, feeling the paper through the fabric solid and real. For the first time all day, the helplessness that had been sitting behind my sternum like a stone began to loosen. Linden Ridge. I would be there before the sun came up. My father's voice came back to me the way it always did in the woods, not as a memory, exactly, but as something already present in the air waiting to be heard. The forest doesn't lie, Zoraya. It only waits for someone who knows how to listen. Osric Quinn had said that to me the first time he brought me up into the Appalachian backcountry the summer I turned 14. He was 58 years old, then moving through the underbrush like he'd been built for it. Quiet, unhurried, reading the ground the way other men read newspapers. He had died 11 years ago, and not a single week had passed since that I hadn't heard him in places like this. It was 5 in the morning and the mountain was dark in the way that was different from night, softer with the first gray light beginning to separate the tree trunks from the sky. Neela was 3 steps behind me, her headlamp tilted down at the ground, her breath coming in small white puffs in the cold. We had left the truck at a Forest Service pullout 2 miles back and come in on foot. No point in announcing ourselves with an engine. Hit there, Nyla said, crouching suddenly. She pressed 2 fingers against the edge of a tire track pressed into the soft red clay of the trail, the kind of depression that fills in within a day if it rains, but last night had stayed dry. Same pattern as yesterday. Look at the rear right. She traced the outline without touching it. The tread on that side is sitting deeper than the left. Axles pulling. This vehicle came through here at least once in the past 48 hours. I crouched beside her and studied it. The track was clear and deliberate, not a vehicle that had wandered off road by accident. Someone had driven this trail on purpose slowly enough to leave a clean impression. He knew the road, I said. Or someone told him how to find it. Neela stood brushing clay off her knees. Either way, he came through here. The question is how far up? We kept moving. The forest at this elevation in September had a particular kind of beauty that I had never found words for. The way the oaks and maples went gold and copper at the edges, while the pines stayed dark green, so the whole hillside looked like something caught between burning and enduring. The ground was damp from 2 days of intermittent rain, which was bad for our boots and very good for reading sign. I found the first broken branch about a quarter-mile in. It was a young hickory sapling about shoulder height, snapped cleanly about 2/3 of the way up its trunk. The break was fresh, the pale wood beneath the bark still bright, not yet oxidized to brown. But the direction was wrong. A deer browsing would have pulled the branch upward or toward itself. Wind damage broke things downward. This one had been pushed sideways toward the tree line, as if something large had moved through and someone had tried to fold the evidence back into the brush. "Somebody's been grooming the trail," I said quietly. Nyla stepped around me to look, and I saw her expression tighten the way it did when she was running calculations. "There's another one," she said, pointing. 10 feet ahead, a second sapling bent at an angle that had nothing to do with nature. They were covering wheel tracks, clearing low branches so the vehicle could pass without snagging. My father had taught me that a trail tells you 2 things: where someone went and how hard they tried not to be followed. The harder the effort, the more important the destination. We stopped at a flat boulder to drink water and check the map. My hands were cold enough that the water bottles stung. I pressed my back against the rock face and looked uphill listening. That was when I heard it. Faint, carried on a gust that moved down from the ridge and then died, a sound so brief I thought at first I had imagined it. A chime. Not the bright, tuneless ring of the aluminum wind chimes people hung on porch railings. This was deeper, with a long resonance after the initial strike, the kind of tone that came from cast bronze that had been hanging outside for decades, weathered and dense with age. My whole body went still. Junie's voice came back to me from our phone call 2 nights ago. There was a weird sound in the background, Grandma Z, like something ringing but slow. She had heard it during that voice message Lucienne played her, the one that sounded like Elowen but didn't feel like her. That sound. Nyla. My voice came out lower than I intended. "Do you hear that?" She had already straightened up from the map, her head tilted. "Wind chime," she said. "Bronze from the tone. Old one." She paused. "Up the ridge. There's an old cabin up on Linden Ridge," I said. "Has been there since before I was born. My father walked me past it when I was 14. It was already abandoned then. But it had chimes on the porch. Cast bronze, heavy gauge, the kind that don't wear out." I pulled the map from my jacket pocket and ran my finger along the contour lines. The prevailing wind on this ridge runs northeast to southwest in the morning. If those chimes are ringing, we're downwind of them. The sound came again, 3 notes this time, spaced and low, rolling down through the trees. Every hair on my arm stood up. Nyla grabbed my sleeve. "Zoraya." Her voice had dropped to something urgent. She was pointing at the ground ahead of us where the tire track ended abruptly at a wide patch of flattened grass. "Look at that." I looked. The wheel marks stopped completely. Beyond them, the vegetation was pressed down in a different pattern, smaller impressions unevenly spaced. Footprints, 2 sets coming from the vehicle, but then 1 set continuing uphill, and beside it, a second set that moved differently, shorter stride, uneven pressure, 1 print significantly deeper on the ball of the foot than the heel. Someone had been dragged. The weight of what I was looking at settled into my chest like cold iron. Not walked, not guided. Dragged, resisting, or unable to walk freely with someone behind them, providing the forward momentum. I straightened up slowly. My jaw was so tight it ached. Nyla's hand found my arm. Her grip was firm grounding. "She's up there," she said, and her voice for the first time all morning cracked just slightly at the edges. "Zoraya, she's up there." I looked up the slope. Through the canopy of gold and copper and dark green, 2 miles of ridge ahead of us, and there, just barely visible, through a gap in the trees where the trail curved a shape that was too straight and too dark to be natural. A roofline. The bronze chimes rang again closer than before, riding the morning wind down through the pines. I was already moving. I heard it before I saw anything. A single dry branch snapping sharp deliberate about 30 yards behind us and slightly uphill. Not the random creak of a tree settling in morning wind. Not a deer picking its way through the brush. This was a footstep. Someone who had been moving carefully for a long time and had just decided they no longer needed to. I grabbed Nyla's sleeve without looking at her and pressed 2 fingers against her forearm, our father's signal. Stop. Split, come around. She understood immediately. That was the thing about growing up in the same mountains with the same teacher. We didn't need words for the important things. Nyla peeled off to the left, disappearing into the tree line with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent years on mountain rescue teams, moving through brush in the dark, looking for people who didn't want to be found. I went right circling wide, keeping low and using the rock outcroppings for cover. I heard Nyla's voice a minute later, flat, carrying no emotion at all, which was how she sounded when she was the most serious. "Hands where I can see them. Right now." I came around the far side of a white oak and saw him. He was standing in a small clearing between 2 hickory trees, both hands raised to shoulder-height palms forward. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, not a hiking jacket, not a flannel shirt, not anything that belonged within 5 miles of this ridgeline. His shoes were Italian leather, already dark with moisture at the toe. He had silver hair cut short and the kind of face that had once been commanding and was now simply tired, deep lines around the mouth, shadows beneath the eyes that sleep alone couldn't account for. Leonard Vail was 68 years old, and he looked every year of it. I had seen his photograph in a business profile once, the patriarch of Vail Capital, standing in a mahogany-paneled office with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to occupy whatever space he chose. The man in front of me looked like someone had taken that photograph and left it out in the rain. Nyla had her knife out, blade down, held with the casual competence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. "Who are you?" she said. "Leonard Vail." His voice was steady. I gave him that. "Allowin's father-in-law." He looked at me, not at Nyla, with the directness of someone deciding how much to invest in a conversation. "I'm not here to stop you, Ms. Mercer." "Then what are you here for?" I said. "To make sure this doesn't become something worse than it already is." I studied him the way my father had taught me to study unfamiliar terrain, looking for what was solid, what would hold weight, and what would give way the moment you trusted it. Leonard Vail's hands were steady. His breathing was controlled, but his jaw was working slightly the way a man's does when he's running calculations behind his eyes. "Does your son know you're here?" I asked. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. "No." "Does your wife?" Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not exactly. More like the look of a man acknowledging a debt he intends to dispute. "No." Nyla lowered the knife slightly but didn't put it away. "So you followed us up here on your own, in that suit." Her voice had a serrated edge to it. "You want to tell us why a man like you is standing in the middle of the Appalachian backcountry at 11 in the morning, looking like he just walked out of a board meeting?" "Because I drove up the access road at 6 o'clock this morning and saw your truck at the Forest Service pull out," Leonard said, "and I knew what that meant." He dropped his hand slowly, watching to make sure Nyla didn't react. "I've known where my son brought her. I've known for days." The words landed in my chest like something cold and blunt. "And you didn't do anything," I said. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. That was almost worse than if he had. "I made calculations," he said. I believed the situation would resolve itself before it became irreversible. Irreversible, I tasted the word. She has an 8-year-old daughter. I'm aware of that. For the first time, something moved behind his eyes, not softness, but a fracture, a hairline crack in the composure. She's in the basement of the cabin, the main structure northwest corner of the property. He said it the way you'd read an address off a document, precise and flat. She was alive as of yesterday evening. He's been pressing her to sign certain documents. She's refused. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I felt it in my back teeth. Nyla made a sound low in her throat, not a word, just a sharp exhale of fury held on a very short leash. "Why are you telling us this?" I said. Leonard straightened his jacket, a reflex something to do with his hands. "Because if Eloan dies in that cabin, every calculation I've made for the past 20 years collapses with her. My son will go to prison. My wife will follow, and everything we've built becomes evidence in a federal investigation." He met my eyes without apology. "I am not a man who does things out of sentiment, Ms. Mercer. I am telling you where she is because it is in my interest for her to be found alive." The honesty of it was almost startling. No pretense, no performance of conscience, just the cold arithmetic of a man who had run the numbers and arrived at the one outcome that served him. "Then stay out of our way," I said. I turned and walked toward the ridge. Behind me, I heard Nyla's boots on the ground for several steps before she fell in beside me. She didn't sheathe the knife until we were a full 100 yards up the slope. I didn't look back, but I knew Leonard Vale was still standing in that clearing, watching us go, working through whatever his next calculation was going to be. The trees thinned as we reached the upper edge of the ridge, and then through a gap in the canopy, where a massive oak had come down in some past storm, I saw it. The cabin sat low against the hillside, weathered gray wood, and a rusted tin roof, 2 windows on the visible face, boarded over with rough-cut planks nailed from the outside. A covered porch half collapsed. The bronze wind chimes hanging from the eave caught the midday light and swayed, sending 3 low notes rolling down through the trees. And underneath the chimes, underneath everything, a sound that was not the wind and not the birds, and not any natural thing this mountain made on its own. A slow, rhythmic knock against wood. Patient, deliberate. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Someone counting time in the dark. Neela told me everything that evening when she met me back at the truck as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and the temperature was falling fast. We had made the call together about an hour after spotting the cabin, a practical decision the kind our father had raised us to make without sentiment. One of us needed to stay on the ridge and keep eyes on the property. One of us needed to go back down into Asheville and work every angle we had left. Neela was faster on foot going downhill, and she had history with Kellen Voss that I didn't. So she went. What she told me I'm going to try to lay out the way she laid it out to me, because the sequence of it matters. She found Kellen in the parking lot of a coffee shop called Ironwood 3 blocks from the sheriff's office, sitting in his personal truck with the engine off and his phone in both hands. She had messaged him from the ridge 3 words need to talk. Ironwood. He had been there when she arrived, which told her something. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, she said, and like he was mad at himself about it. She slid into the passenger seat without asking. He didn't tell her to get out. She told me the first thing she said to him was not a question. It was a statement delivered the way Nyla delivered everything she meant straight, no softening, no apology for the edges. You know something is wrong, and you're choosing to do nothing. Kellen didn't argue with her. That was the first sign. He stared at the windshield for a moment, then he told her what had happened the previous afternoon after we left the sheriff's office. Orson had picked up his personal cell before Zoraya's car had even cleared the parking lot. Kellen couldn't hear both sides of the conversation, but he heard the name Morell, and he watched his boss's shoulders relax, the way a man's do when he's reporting to someone who already knows the plan and is pleased with how it's going. Then Orson had gone back to his desk, pulled up the record system, and reclassified the case file, changed the status code. Alain Vale's name, which had been entered as a potential missing person, however inadequately, was now logged as a voluntary wellness check, closed no further action required. In the CAD system that every deputy in Buncombe County could access, she no longer existed as a concern. He just typed it in, Kellen told Nyla, like it was nothing, like changing a word in a spreadsheet. Nyla said her hands had gone tight in her lap when she heard that. She pressed them flat against her thighs to keep from doing something she'd regret. Then she asked him about the debt. Not the money kind, the kind that's harder to pay back. You remember the winter of 2019, she said. Kellen turned to look at her for the first time since she'd gotten in the truck. His jaw worked once. He remembered. January 14th, 2019. A nor'easter had come through the mountains 2 days ahead of the forecast, dropping 14 inches in 6 hours on the upper ridges. Orson Pike had gone up toward Linden Ridge in his department SUV for a reason he'd never fully explained. Off-duty, no radio, no log. The vehicle had gone off the road on a switchback and rolled into a drainage ditch. He'd been pinned for 2 hours before Neela, coming down from a solo trail assessment, had found him. She had dug him out with her hands and a folding shovel she carried in her pack. She had wrapped him in her emergency blanket and half carried him down 2 miles of iced-over trail in the dark. His core temperature had been low enough that another 30 minutes outside would have ended him. He had thanked her once formally and never mentioned it again. He owes this family. Nyla told Kellen, and I could hear in how she described it that her voice had gone tight and hot. He owes me, and he is spending that debt on the people who put a woman in a basement. Kellen looked out the windshield again. His throat moved. His hands wrapped around the steering wheel, even though the engine was off, were white at the knuckles. I know, he said. Then do something. I can't file a report, Nyla. His voice cracked on the last word, not from weakness, she told me, but from the particular strain of a man fighting against something he's wanted to do for a while and keeps talking himself out of. Not without evidence that doesn't come from me. Orson would bury it in 20 minutes and I'd be off the force by Wednesday. He let out a breath that seemed to cost him something. But I can look the other way when you do what you need to do. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a case file number, the original before the reclassification, and below it a name and an address on the south side of Asheville. Wyatt Turner, 28 years old, drove a delivery truck for a small freight outfit out of Weaverville, had made 2 runs up a private access road north of the city in the past 10 days, both times hauling a generator, canned goods, and a locked container he'd been told held medical equipment. Wyatt Turner didn't know what he'd been hauling, but he knew where he'd taken it. Neela had barely finished telling me all of this when her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen and her expression shifted, not alarm, but the careful, controlled attention she got when something new entered the equation. She typed the address to my phone and added a second message below it. Be careful. Someone named Sabine Holt has been asking around about you. Checked in at the hotel on Merriman yesterday. She's connected to Lucienne, I don't know how yet, but she knows your name. I read the message twice. The last light was leaving the ridge above us, and the cabin was invisible again in the dark tree line. Sabine Holt, a name I didn't know yet, but the fact that she was looking for me before I was looking for her told me something I didn't like at all. The freight yard on the north side of Weaverville smelled like diesel and damp cardboard, the kind of smell that settles into the walls of a place and never quite leaves. It was 7:40 in the morning when Neela and I pulled through the chain-link gate, and the lot was already half lit by a weak September sun cutting through low clouds. We found Wyatt Turner's truck, first a white Isuzu box truck with a dented rear bumper and a company decal half peeled off the passenger door. Then we found Wyatt himself coming around the side of the warehouse with a clipboard under his arm and a coffee cup in his hand, unlocking the side entrance with the unhurried ease of a man who had no idea his Monday was about to change completely. He looked up, saw us standing between him and his truck, and stopped walking. He was younger than I'd expected, 28, but he carried it like 22 all lanky limbs and an open face that hadn't yet learned how to hide what was moving behind it. Right now, what was moving behind it was something between confusion and a fear he hadn't quite named yet. "Can I help you?" His voice came out steady enough, but his grip on the coffee cup tightened until his knuckles went pale. "Wyatt Turner," I said, not a question. "You made 2 deliveries to a private property on Linden Ridge, September 5th and September 11th, left the yard at 6:45 both mornings. Generator canned goods, a locked container labeled medical supplies." I watched his face go the color of old chalk. "We need to talk about those runs." His mouth opened, closed. His eyes cut sideways toward the gate, the instinct of someone calculating whether they could get there before we could follow. "I don't know what you're—" "Wyatt." Nyla stepped forward, not aggressive, just close enough that he had to look at her. Her voice was flat and precise, the way it got when she was done with preamble. "A woman is locked in the basement of that cabin right now. She has a little girl at home who hasn't heard her mother's voice in 6 days. So I need you to stop doing the math on whether you can walk away from this conversation, because you can't. And the sooner you talk to us, the better things go for you." That landed. His coffee cup tilted in his hand and a dark splash hit the concrete by his boot. He didn't notice. "I didn't know," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "I swear to God I didn't know what it was for. She said it was a hunting cabin off-season prep, that the owner wanted the place stocked before winter." He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a second, eyes going bright and wet at the corners. "She paid cash, $1,400 for 2 runs. I've got a kid, my girlfriend just lost her job. I didn't ask questions. I should have asked questions." "Who hired you?" I said. "A woman named Sabine Holt. She called me through a mutual contact, said she needed discreet freight work, no paperwork." He set the coffee cup down on the warehouse step because his hand was shaking too badly to hold it steadily. "She gave me the address and the access code for the gate, said don't call ahead, just go up, leave it on the porch and go." "Did you go inside the property?" "No. I walked around the cabin to find the best place to leave the generator. The porch was rotted on one side, so I went around back." He stopped. His throat moved hard. "That's when I saw her." The air between us tightened. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said. Wyatt pressed his palms flat against his thighs, steadying himself the way people did when they were about to say something that had been sitting wrong in their chest for days. "There was a basement window, ground level about this big." He held his hands a foot apart. "The glass was dirty, but I could see through it. There was a woman sitting against the wall. She had her knees pulled up and her head down." His voice dropped to something rough and low. "She had her wrist tied to the pipe running along the wall. I could see the marks on her arm from where I was standing." My stomach turned over hard and cold. Beside me, Nyla made a sound like someone had knocked the air out of her, a short, strangled exhale that she cut off immediately, jaw-clenching tight. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked, and I kept my voice level because I needed him talking, not defending himself. Because I'd taken $1,400 in cash to haul things to that location. His eyes were streaming. Now tears spilling down without him seeming to notice or care. "I didn't know what was in that locked container. What if it was? What if they said I was part of it? I've got a record. Small stuff, nothing violent. But it's there." I thought I told myself maybe I'd misread what I saw. Maybe she was sleeping. Maybe the tie was something else. He wiped his face with his sleeve, rough and fast disgusted with himself. "I've been telling myself that for 5 days and I haven't slept a single night." Before I could respond, the phone in his front pocket buzzed. He looked down at the screen and the color that had just started coming back into his face drained away again completely. I stepped close enough to see the notification. "Sabine, did anyone come looking for you?" Wyatt's hand was trembling visibly now, the phone rattling faintly against his palm. "She's been checking in every day," he said. "Ever since I think she's scared. She keeps asking if I've talked to anyone. It's like she's more scared of him than of getting caught." I looked at that message for a long moment. Sabine Holt sitting somewhere in Asheville, watching her own back because the man she'd helped was becoming something she could no longer predict or control. I put my hand on Wyatt's shoulder. He was rigid under my palm, coiled tight with guilt and sleeplessness, and 5 days of making himself look the other way. "You didn't know," I said, "but now you do, and that changes things. You didn't know what you were delivering. That matters in a courtroom. Intent matters. A witness who comes forward voluntarily looks very different from someone who stays quiet. And right now, you still have a choice about which one you are." The phone buzzed again. Same number. A call this time. Wyatt stared at it. His finger hovered over the screen. Then he pressed the red button and sent it to voicemail. His whole body sagged slightly, like a cord that had been cut. "I have something else," he said. He set the phone down on the warehouse step, reached into the clipboard he'd been carrying, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the kind of fold that comes from something being opened and refolded many times by nervous hands. He smoothed it against his thigh and held it out. It was a hand-drawn diagram, rough pencil lines on unlined paper, but careful measured with distances noted at each wall. The cabin footprint, the access road, the tree line, and marked clearly in 2 places, the front entrance facing the road, and a second entry point at the rear of the structure tucked under the overhang of a pine stand on the northwest corner. A service door, low, half-hidden, one that didn't appear on any property record. "She drew that for me so I could find the place the first time," Wyatt said. "I kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it." I took the diagram from his hands. The paper was soft from handling the pencil lines slightly smudged, but the measurements were clear. There were 2 ways into that cabin, and Lucian Vale only knew we'd come through the front. This is the moment I've been building toward. From the very first scene, the locked cellar door, the knocking from underneath, and Lucian Vale standing between 2 women and the only exit. Before I reveal what happens when everything collides in that room, comment the word door below so I know you're still with me. Just so you know, some details in what follows have been shaped for storytelling purposes. If that's not something you want to continue with, no judgment at all, you can step away here. But if you stay, I promise it's worth it. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing peaceful about it. Not the silence of an empty forest at dawn, not the silence of a house where everyone is sleeping. This was something different, dense, pressurized like air in a room where someone has been screaming and recently stopped. I felt it the moment Nyla and I pushed through the service door at the back of the cabin and stepped inside. The door had been padlocked, but the hasp was old, and the wood around it had been softening for years. 2 minutes with the pry bar Neela had carried up from the truck, and it gave without much argument. Whatever Lucian had secured, he'd secured the front, not expecting anyone to know about the back. Inside the cabin smelled of damp timber and generator exhaust, and something underneath both of those, something chemical and close, that made the back of my throat tighten. A folding table had been set up against one wall with a camping lantern and a row of prescription bottles. I didn't touch them, but I read the labels from where I stood. Sedatives. The same class of compound I'd smelled in Lucian's living room 3 days ago. Neela moved to the front windows, checking the approach road. I moved toward the center of the floor. The trapdoor wasn't hidden. There was no point in hiding it when you owned the only key. But the hardware on it was brand new. A heavy-duty padlock still bright with the sheen of recent manufacture set into a steel plate that had been bolted through the existing wood. Someone had come up here with tools and installed this deliberately over time before any of this began. The floor around the lock plate was scratched long, ragged marks in the old wood that went in every direction, like something had been scraping against it from the other side for a long time. My knees hit the floor before I'd made a conscious decision to kneel. I pressed my palm flat against the wood beside the lock. The boards were cold under my hand. I put my mouth close to the gap between the planks and said her name. Elowen. 1 second, 2, 3, then 3 knocks. slow, deliberate from directly below. 1, 1, 1. My eyes burned. I pressed my fist against my sternum for a single second hard, because if I let the feeling that was rising in my chest reach my face right now, I was going to be useless. I needed to be useful. "We're here," I said loud enough to carry through the floor. "We're going to get you out. Stay back from the door." 3 more knocks. She had heard me. That was when I heard the engine. Nyla was at my side in 2 steps, her hand gripping my arm. "Vehicle on the access road," she said, her voice stripped down to pure function. "Coming fast, 1 driver." We had maybe 90 seconds. I looked at the padlock. I looked at Nyla. She was already shaking her head. The lock was rated steel. The pry bar wouldn't touch it without the right angle and more time than we had. "Get Kellen on the phone," I said. "Right now. Don't stop talking to him no matter what happens in this room." She had the phone out before I finished the sentence. The front door of the cabin opened with the sound of a key in a new lock, precise, deliberate, the sound of a man who owned the mechanism. Lucian Vale stepped inside and saw us. I had seen him composed. I had seen him warm and practiced, and completely in command of every room he walked into. This was not that man. His face had gone tight across the jaw, a muscle working in his cheek. His eyes moved from me to Nyla to the trap door and back to me in one fast sweep, and something shifted behind them. Not panic, not yet, but the first hairline fracture of a man whose plan has just encountered a variable he didn't account for. His right hand was clenched around his car keys so hard the metal must have been cutting into his palm. "This is private property," he said. His voice was controlled, but the warmth was entirely gone, stripped out, leaving something underneath that was flat and cold and much closer to the truth of him. "Then open that door," I said, pointing at the trap door, "and show me she's okay." His jaw tightened further. He didn't move toward the trap door. "I'm going to have to ask you both to leave," he said, "or I'll call the sheriff's office and have you removed for trespass." "Call them," Nyla said from behind me, her phone pressed to her ear, eyes fixed on Lucienne, with an expression I recognized the look she got when she was deciding how much damage she was willing to absorb to protect something she loved. "Go ahead and call Orson. See how that plays out for you today." Something flickered across Lucian's face at the name, a recalculation. He took 1 step toward me, the keys still clenched in his fist, his body angled to cut off my path to the trap door. He was bigger than me. He was betting on that mattering. Nyla moved before he took the second step, not toward him, but sideways, planting herself between us, with her shoulder dropped and her feet set in the wide, grounded stance of someone who had pulled people twice her size out of collapsed snowbanks and knew exactly how to use her body as an anchor. "Don't," she said, 1 word, quiet as a door closing. And from beneath our feet the knocking started again, not the slow, measured signal from before. This was different, faster, both fists by the sound of it hitting the wood in a ragged rhythm that had urgency and fear and something ferocious underneath all of it. "Elowin." The word tore out of me before I could stop it. The knocking got louder. Lucian went very still. The calculation in his eyes shifted again. He was counting something, measuring something, running a version of the next 5 minutes that I couldn't see. And then from down the access road, thin through the trees, but unmistakable, a siren. 1 vehicle. Moving fast up the mountain. I looked at the door. I looked at Lucien. His expression had closed off completely, everything locked behind his eyes, giving nothing away. I didn't know if it was Kellen. I didn't know if it was Orson. But someone was coming, and the next 60 seconds were going to tell me everything about whether we were getting Elowin out of that basement today. The cruiser came around the bend in the access road and stopped 20 feet from the cabin's front steps. Kellen Voss got out alone. No backup. No Orson. Just him, 1 hand resting on his belt, taking in the scene through the open front door. Lucienne standing rigid in the center of the room. Nyla 3 feet away with her feet planted and her eyes fixed on him like she was daring him to move. and me beside the trapdoor with a bolt cutter in my hands that I had carried up from the truck that morning on the particular hunch that a new padlock would require a specific kind of argument. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Kellen stepped inside. His eyes went to the trapdoor, to the new lock plate, to the scratch marks radiating out from the edges of it, like something desperate had been reaching for the surface for days. His jaw tightened. He looked at Lucian. "Lucian Vale," he said, "I'm detaining you on suspicion of unlawful imprisonment. Turn around." Lucian's composure cracked all the way through. "You have no authority to this is my property. There is no one in that. Turn around." Kellen's voice didn't rise. It just went very flat and very certain, the voice of a man who had made his decision somewhere on the mountain road coming up and was not revisiting it. Lucian turned. The cuffs went on with a sound like finality. Neela took Lucian by the arm and walked him to the far corner of the room without a word, her grip firm enough that he didn't test it. I was already on my knees at the trapdoor. The bolt cutter went through the padlock shackle on the second try. The steel was good, but the angle was right, and I had my father's trick of putting the weight of your whole upper body into the handle, rather than just your arms. The lock hit the floor with a heavy clank. I pulled the trapdoor up. The smell came first damp stone and stale air, and the particular staleness of a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in days. The darkness below was total until I angled my flashlight down the rough wooden steps. Ilawan was in the far corner. She was sitting with her back against the stone foundation wall, knees drawn up one wrist bearing the chafe marks of something that had been removed recently. The rope or zip tie was gone, which told me she'd worked it loose herself, or Lucian had removed it for his last visit. Her hair was loose and tangled, her lips cracked white at the corners. She had her eyes closed when the light hit her. Then she opened them. Dark eyes. Her father's bone structure, her mother's mouth. I had studied that face in photographs for 22 years and in person across 22 years of careful distance. Right now, it was stripped of everything she usually wore in my presence. The guardedness, the cold politeness, the wall she'd built and maintained and reinforced every time I'd come within reach of it. What was left underneath was just a woman who was 31 years old and had been in the dark for too long. Ilawan. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "It's me. Can you stand?" She looked at me for a long moment, not with suspicion, not with the old reflexive hostility, with something rawer than that. Something that looked like a person recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a situation. "I can stand," she said. Her voice was rough, scraped thin, but it was hers. She got her feet under her. Her legs shook with the effort, and I went down the steps and put my hand under her elbow without asking permission, and she let me. That was the thing I would remember longest about that moment. Not the words, not the tears that started coming down her face as soon as she was upright, quiet and uncontrolled, like her body had decided it was finally safe to fall apart a little. What I would remember was that she let me put my hand under her arm, and she didn't pull away. We were halfway up the steps when she stopped and turned back. "Wait," she said. "There's something." She pointed toward the far wall where an old security camera was mounted near the ceiling, its casing gray with dust. A small red indicator light glowed steadily at its base. "The generator powers the whole cabin. I saw the light come on the second night." Her voice tightened with something fierce and focused. "I moved it. Every time he came in, I waited until he wasn't looking, and I moved it a little more. It's been pointed at the table where he made me sign things for the last 4 days." I looked at the camera. The angle was deliberate, unmistakable. "That's everything," she said. "Everything he said to me, everything he threatened. It's all on there." I looked back at her face, at the exhaustion and the split lip and the hollows under her eyes, and felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. This woman had been locked in a basement, running out of food and water and options, and she had spent her energy not on screaming or breaking down, but on building evidence. Isolde's daughter. No question about it. We came up into the cabin, and Nyla made a sound when she saw Elowen, low and involuntary, the sound of someone who has been holding their breath for days, and crossed the room in 3 steps to wrap both arms around her. Elowen held on. Outside, the September night had come down fully cool and clear. I walked Elowen onto the porch, one hand at her back, and she stopped at the top of the steps and looked up. The moon was 3/4 full above the ridge, throwing silver light through the thinning canopy. She stood there with her face tilted up and breathed a long, slow breath, inhaled then, released, like she was checking to make sure the air still worked the way she remembered. Then she turned and looked at me. "How did you find me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your mother left me a map," I said. The words landed on her face like something she didn't know how to catch. Her brow drew together. Her lips parted. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something in a language you recognize but haven't spoken in a very long time. I started to turn toward the car. Elowen's voice stopped me. Barely audible rough, with something much older than exhaustion. "She gave you a map." I didn't answer right away, because some questions aren't really questions. They're 22 years of a story starting to come apart at the seams, one thread at a time. I went back down into the basement alone. Nyla waited at the top of the steps with the flashlight aimed down at my feet, not asking questions. She knew me well enough to know that when I turned back toward a place I'd just left, I had a reason. The reason was a single line from Isolde's journal, one I had read in my cabin 4 nights ago. By lamplight alone, my voice strange and small in the quiet. I had stored it in the back of my mind the way I stored trail markers, the way my father had taught me, to file away details that didn't yet have a context. He keeps what he steals in the place he thinks no one will look. I had been so focused on finding Elowen that I hadn't finished the thought until now, standing again in the dark and damp of this basement with the trapdoor hanging open above me. Thayer had used this cabin for years before Isolde died. He had driven up here alone with no explanation, and she had marked it on her map. She had known about it, and she had known what kind of man her husband was, not a violent man, not a cruel one, but the kind of man who helped himself to things that weren't entirely his, and told himself the difference was small enough not to matter. I went to the far wall and started on the floorboards. The third one I tried gave not easily, but with the particular reluctance of wood that had been disturbed before and relaid without quite settling back into place. Underneath, wrapped in an oilcloth that had kept most of the moisture out, was a metal box about the size of a document case, its surface mottled brown and red with old rust. My hands were steady when I lifted it. The rest of me was not. Inside a folder of papers, their edges soft with age. The original trust documents for Olo and Harrow's inheritance, not a copy, the original with Isolde's signature on the establishing page, and the name of the trustee typed clearly at the top, Aldrich Rowe Attorney, at Law, Asheville, North Carolina. Not Thayer. Never Thayer. Isolde had made that decision deliberately, and she had made it years before she died. Beneath the trust documents, a single sheet of paper that had been partially altered figures, crossed out replacement numbers written in a different hand, and one signature line where the ink was slightly too uniform, slightly too perfect, the way ink looks when it's been traced rather than signed. Someone had been practicing Elowen's signature, and at the very bottom of the box, folded once addressed in Isolde's handwriting, "For Zoraya," when she finds this. My throat closed. I unfolded it and read it standing there in the cold basement, with Nyla's flashlight throwing my shadow long against the stone wall. If you found this, it means Thayer failed again. He always does. Eventually, not out of malice, just out of weakness, which is almost worse. I'm leaving this here because I don't trust him to keep it safe, and I can't leave it with Aldrich yet without questions. I'm not ready to answer. You'll know what to do with it. You always do. Keep this safe for Elowen. She'll need it more than she knows. I stood there for a long moment, the paper in my hands, Isolde's words sitting in my chest like something warm that had no right to be there after 22 years of cold. Then I folded it back up, put everything in the box, tucked the box under my arm, and climbed back up into the light. Mission Hospital was 40 minutes down the mountain. Alawan had been admitted the night before for dehydration, malnutrition, and a hairline fracture in her left wrist from where the restraint had been too tight for too many days. She was in a private room on the 3rd floor. She had asked the nurse to let me in. She looked better than she had the night before, which was not saying much. The IV line in her arm was doing its work, some color returning to her face. She was sitting up in the bed with her knees drawn up when I came in, and she watched me cross the room without speaking, which was its own kind of progress. She was watching me the way you watch someone you're reconsidering, not the way you watch someone you want to leave. I sat down, put the metal box on the bedside table between us. She looked at it. "What is that?" "Your mother left it in the cabin basement. Apparently she knew Thayer used that place." I paused. She knew more than he realized. Alawan's eyes moved from the box to my face. "How much more?" I told her what the documents showed: the original trust, Aldrich Rowe's name as trustee, the altered signature page. She listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening incrementally, her hands pressing flat against her knees, the way they did when she was absorbing something she didn't want to absorb. When I finished, she said, "Lucian knew I'd found out about the fund." "Tell me." She exhaled long and slow. 6 months ago, I was going through the household accounts. Something didn't add up in the way the Vail Foundation was structured. I started pulling threads. She shook her head slightly. "The art fund is a shell. It takes in donations from private collectors, cycles the money through auction house commissions, and distributes the cleaned funds as grants to entities that Morell controls. It's not complicated, it's just old, and nobody ever looked at it carefully." Her voice went flat with a controlled anger that had clearly been sitting in her for a long time. When I told Lucian what I'd found, he went very still, the way he goes still when he's deciding something. She touched the bandage on her wrist without seeming to realize she was doing it. 2 weeks later, he started talking about my mental health. I reached into the box and took out Isolde's letter, held it out. Alawan looked at it, at the handwriting on the outside, her name in her mother's hand. She took it from me slowly, the way you take something you're afraid of dropping. She read it. I watched her face as she did the small movements, the way her brow drew together and then smoothed the moment her chin dropped and her shoulders went in, and a sound came out of her that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite anything else, just the sound of a person meeting something they had been unknowingly waiting for their entire adult life. The tears came after that quiet and steady running down her face while she held the paper in both hands and didn't try to stop them. I didn't reach for her. I didn't speak. I just stayed in the chair beside her, close enough that she knew I was there, and let her have the moment that had been 22 years in arriving. My phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. Kellen. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Orson knows she's out," he said, his voice low and taut. "He's already made 2 calls I can't account for. I think he's trying to get the case file reclassified again before the hospital report triggers a mandatory review." A pause. "There's something else. Sabine Holt called me an hour ago. She said she wants to meet. She wants to talk about what she knows." Another pause, heavier than the first. She used the word immunity. Through the window in the door, I could see Alawan still holding her mother's letter, still reading it, her shoulders curved over it like she was sheltering it from something. "Set up the meeting," I said. Alawan signed herself out of Mission Hospital at 1 in the afternoon against the recommendation of her attending physician and with an IV bruise still fresh on the inside of her left arm. The doctor wanted another 24 hours. Alawan said she had somewhere she needed to be. I didn't argue. I had learned in the past 48 hours that Alawan Harrow Vale was not a woman who needed to be argued out of things. She needed to be given the truth and then left to make her own decisions. Aldrich Rowe's office was on Lexington Avenue on the second floor of a building that had been standing since the 1940s and looked like it. Dark wood paneling bookshelves that went floor to ceiling, the particular smell of paper and old leather that collects in rooms where important things have been kept for a long time. A secretary showed us in without making us wait. Aldrich Rowe was standing behind his desk when we came through the door. He was 58, silver-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had spent decades being precise about everything. He looked at me first, then at Elowen, and then something moved across his face that he didn't try to hide. His eyes went red at the rims. His jaw tightened once, and he pressed his lips together for just a moment before he spoke. "I've been waiting for this day for 22 years, he said. Elowen looked at him. "You knew my mother." "I did." He came around the desk slowly, the way a person moves when they're carrying something heavy and don't want to spill it. She was one of the clearest thinking people I've ever represented. She knew exactly what she wanted to protect and exactly who she trusted to protect it. He gestured to the chairs. "Please, sit down. There's a great deal I should have been able to tell you years ago." He opened the file. The trust documents were pristine, not a mark on them, not a page out of order. The original signatures crisp under the protective sleeve Aldrich had kept them in for 2 decades. The principal, $12.6 million accumulated from Isolde's family inheritance and several early investments made before her marriage. The beneficiary, Elowen Harrow, sole and irrevocable. The trustee, Aldrich Rowe. And at the bottom of the secondary instructions page, a clause that I had not seen in the box documents a designation that Aldrich had kept in a sealed envelope in his office safe for 22 years. He slid it across the desk to Elowen. She unfolded it. "Read it." Her breathing changed. I heard it a slight catch at the top of her inhale, the sound of someone whose chest has just tightened around something unexpected. She passed the paper to me without speaking. Isolde's handwriting, the same tight, precise script I had read by lamplight in my cabin and in the cold of a basement at dawn. "In the event that my daughter requires a secondary guardian or advocate at any point in her life, I designate Zariah Quinn, not because she is family by blood, but because she is family by choice. Zariah Quinn will protect my daughter better than anyone, because she is the only one who loves without wanting anything in return. I have seen this. I know this to be true." My hands were not entirely steady when I set the paper back on the desk. Aldrich was watching Elowen. "Your mother wrote that 4 months before she passed," he said gently. She was very deliberate about it. She made me read it back to her twice. Elowen had her hand pressed flat against the center of her chest, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the far wall, her throat moving. She was working through something that didn't have a fast solution. 22 years of a story she had believed completely cracking open along seams she hadn't known were there. "She knew," Elowen said finally. Her voice was rough. "She knew what my father would do." "She had a realistic understanding of who he was," Aldrich said, careful, kind. "She loved him, but she planned around him." I thought of the hawks in the basement, the map, the sealed letter, an entire architecture of protection that Isolde had built around her daughter before she died piece by piece, knowing she wouldn't be there to maintain it herself. I excused myself for a moment and stepped into the hallway. I called Junie. She picked up on the first ring the way children do when they've been watching the phone. "Grandma Z." Her voice was so small, so careful, the voice of a child who had been keeping herself very controlled for 5 very long days. "She's safe, baby," I said. "Your mama is safe. She's going to see you soon." The sound that came through the phone after that, I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. Not a word, not a sentence. Just a child's sob, sudden and total, the kind of crying that only happens when something you've been holding with everything you have finally gets to put itself down. She cried for a full minute, and I stood in that hallway with my back against the wall and let her, because she had earned every single second of it. When the crying eased, she said, "I knew you'd find her, Grandma Z. I knew you would. You're the one who made it possible." I said, "You called me. You're the reason we found her." She didn't quite believe me yet, but she would. Thayer's house was on the way back. Elowen asked me to stop. I did. She went in alone, and I waited in the truck. I don't know exactly what was said in that house. She didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. What I know is that she was inside for 11 minutes, and when she came back out, she walked straight and steady down the porch steps with her arms at her sides and her face very calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with resolution. She got in the truck. She didn't speak right away, and I didn't push. I pulled out onto the road and headed back toward Asheville. After a few minutes, she turned and looked at me from the passenger seat. "She chose you," Elowen said, "because she knew you'd never let anyone take her place." I kept my eyes on the road. The afternoon light was going gold and low across the ridgeline, the mountains going amber and dark on either side of the highway, the kind of light that made everything look like something worth keeping. I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that was adequate, but my hands tightened on the wheel, not from tension, not from the old habit of holding myself together, from something else entirely, something that had not had room to exist for 22 years and was only now slowly beginning to find its shape. The knock landed at 9:04 a.m., 3 measured raps, not urgent, not hesitant. The kind of knock that says, "I know you're there, and I've decided to let you in." Room 14 at the Ridgeline Suites on Merriman Avenue was the last door on the second floor, away from the ice machine and the stairwell. Kellen had tracked the alias Rebecca Marsh Paid Cash, checked in 2 nights ago, and texted me the room number without comment. That was the thing about Kellen. He'd stopped needing to explain himself. The woman who opened the door didn't look like someone in hiding. Sabine Holt stood straight-backed in a dark gray blazer, her brown hair pulled into a loose knot at the back of her neck. She was holding a half-empty coffee cup in her left hand, and her eyes dark, careful the eyes of someone who had spent years reading rooms before entering them, moved from my face to Nyla's and back again without expression. There were shadows beneath her eyes that she hadn't tried to cover. That told me more than anything else. She stepped aside without being asked. The room was deliberately impersonal. No open luggage, nothing on the nightstand, no personal items left where someone else might touch them. A laptop sat open on the desk beside a small printer, and a USB drive rested on a folded hotel notepad. She'd been ready before we knocked, possibly for longer than this morning. "You checked in as Rebecca Marsh," I said. "I did." She set her coffee down on the dresser with the precision of someone rationing their movements. I'd appreciate it if that name stayed out of official reports. For now. Neela closed the door and leaned against the wall with her arms folded, watching Sabine the way she watched weather rolling off a ridge, not hostile, just assessing what it might cost. I sat down across from Sabine without being invited. "Tell me what you know." She didn't flinch. She brought the desk chair around and sat facing me, elbows on her knees, hands loosely folded. Her composure was real, not performed. I'd spent enough time around people who were pretending to be calm to know the difference. Sabine Holt was someone who had made a decision and was living inside it. 2 years ago, she said, Lucian approached me with an arrangement. He needed someone inside the Vale legal structure with clean credentials, enough distance from the family to provide deniability if anything went wrong. She paused, and something moved across her face. Not shame exactly. More like the expression of a person who has recently stopped telling themselves a story they'd believed for a long time. He told me Elowen was unstable, that she was a danger to herself and to Junie, that he needed help managing her access to the trust until he could secure full legal guardianship. And you believed him, I said. I believed the documents on She Said. I believed the structure he built around it. What he described sounded like a legal problem with a legal solution. Her jaw tightened just slightly, just once. I told myself the money was secondary, that I was helping manage a genuine situation. She looked at her hands. I was very good at telling myself that. What changed? She stood cross to the desk and turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was an email chain, internal Vale correspondence, time-stamped September 3rd, 2024. Sender Lucien Vale. Recipient Morel Vale. Subject line Final Sig. September 15th deadline, no extensions. I read the body once. Then again. In clean businesslike language, the language of board memos and quarterly reviews, Lucien had outlined a timeline for obtaining LON's signature on the trust transfer documents. If she refused, he noted alternative psychological pressure methods remain available. He had CC'd a private psychiatrist, not Dr. Armitage, the name I'd heard Lucien drop at his kitchen table 10 days ago, but someone I didn't recognize at all. Someone whose name appeared in none of LON's official medical history. Someone sourced separately for a purpose that had nothing to do with her care. I intended to look up that name the moment I left this room. My chest didn't tighten. It went completely terribly still. Morel replied, I asked. 14 minutes later. Sabine scrolled down. The reply was 6 words. Understood. Keep the timeline. L handled. Nothing else. No punctuation after the last word. The shorthand of people who had done this kind of thing before and no longer needed to spell it out. Does Morel know LON is already out? I asked. As of this morning, no. Sabine's voice was flat factual. She knows something went wrong because Lucien stopped responding after Monday, but she doesn't know the scope of it yet. She crossed her arms. When she finds out, she'll move to protect the Empire first, Lucien second. That's always been her order. A beat. She's not going to fight for him. She's going to calculate what saving him costs versus what cutting him loose saves. Neela made a quiet sound from the wall, not a word, just a breath, the kind that means I already knew people were like this, but it still lands every time. And Leonard, I asked, contacted his personal attorney last night. Sabine reached across the desk and picked up the USB drive, holding it between 2 fingers. He's separating himself formally on record. Whatever Leonard Vale is, he's not going down with the ship he helped build. I took the USB from her hand. It was warm from sitting on the notepad all morning. What's on it? I asked. 12 days of cabin security footage complete, Lucien's real schedule, every visit, every date, and the full email chain you just read plus 7 others going back to August. She met my eyes without wavering. It's enough. Why are you doing this? I asked. Not to challenge her, I needed to understand the shape of it. She was quiet for a moment, genuinely quiet the way people are when they're answering honestly rather than strategically. I thought I was using him, she said. The arrangement made sense to me. The money was real. The promise felt real. She looked toward the window where pale morning light pressed through the curtain. Turns out he was using everyone. Me, LON, his parents, Junie, without thinking twice about any of it. Something final settled in her voice, the sound of a door closing on a version of herself she'd decided to leave behind. I'm not doing this because I suddenly grew a conscience. I'm doing this because if I don't, I'm the only one still holding the bag when it falls apart, and I've worked too hard for that. Give us everything you have, I said. That's all I need right now. She nodded once. I already did. I stood, slid the USB into my coat pocket, and turned toward the door. Nyla caught my eye and gave the smallest nod good. My phone buzzed before I reached the handle. Kellen. Orson just filed a counter report. Claims you trespassed and stole evidence from the cabin. He's trying to flip the script. I read it twice. Outside Merriman Avenue was moving through its ordinary Wednesday car engines, a distant radio, the unremarkable sounds of a city that didn't know what was coming apart inside it. I typed back 4 words. Let him try. The call came at 7 on the dot. Not 7:02, not 6:58. Exactly 7, the way a man calls when he's rehearsed the moment and doesn't want to waste a single second of his own time. I was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table in the rental unit Nyla had booked on Lexington Avenue, my second cup of coffee going cold beside a legal pad covered in my own handwriting. When I saw the number unlisted, but I recognized the area code, my hand didn't shake. I just picked up. "Ms. Mercer." Leonard Vale's voice was the same as it had been on the ridge, measured unhurried, the voice of a man who'd spent decades making rooms go quiet when he entered. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." "You have 5 minutes," I said. "Talk." He didn't bristle. "I have documentation," he said. 12 years of financial transfers between Vale Enterprises and 3 shell entities registered in the Cayman Islands. The Art Fund, the property transactions in Henderson County, the wire sequences that connect to accounts Lucian controls independently of the family holdings. A brief pause. "I also have the original correspondence establishing those accounts, including the one Elowin's forged signature appears on." My pen stopped moving. "What do you want?" I asked. "Full immunity," he said. "From federal prosecution, reduced exposure on the civil side." Another pause, shorter this time. "I am not calling you because I regret anything, Ms. Mercer. I want that understood. I'm calling because I can see what direction this is moving, and I'd rather be standing on solid ground when it arrives." I almost respected the honesty. Almost. "That's not my call," I said. "Talk to the FBI." "I will," he said. "But they'll move faster if you're already in the room." We met at a coffee shop on Haywood Street at 9:15 neutral ground, public enough that neither of us could make a scene, private enough that the 3 other customers paid us no attention. Leonard arrived alone, no attorney, a leather folio under his arm. He looked older in morning light than he had in the forest. The gray suit was the same cut, but there were shadows under his eyes that the ridge hadn't shown me. He set the folio on the table and pushed it toward me without preamble. "Everything is indexed," he said. "The USB is inside the front pocket. The paper copies are notarized." I opened the folio. The USB was there, small black, labeled in neat handwriting, VE Financial /2012 to 2024. Beside it, a stack of documents, each page tabbed and initialed. 12 years, I said. 11 years, 8 months, he corrected. I was precise. I looked at him across the table. He met my eyes without difficulty. No guilt, no appeal for understanding. Just the flat, clear gaze of a man presenting a transaction. "You watched this happen," I said. "For almost 12 years. I ran a company," he said. "What Lucian did inside that structure was his architecture, not mine." "Allowin was your daughter-in-law." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt, not quite. More like the expression of a man acknowledging a fact he'd been professionally ignoring. "Yes," he said. "She was." He didn't add anything. I didn't ask him to. I closed the folio. "I'll be at the FBI field office at 2 o'clock, I said. "If you want to be useful, have your attorney there." He nodded once, picked up his coffee, and didn't say another word. At 11:47 that same morning, the same time Junie had called me 6 days earlier, though I didn't notice the parallel until later, Kellen Voss walked into the federal building on Otis Street and submitted a formal complaint packet to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Nyla told me afterward that he'd driven there alone, no backup, no union rep. Just Kellen and a sealed envelope containing the original case file Orson had deleted from the CAD system. A recorded phone call between Orson and Morel Vale, dated September 14th, and a 7-page sworn statement covering what Kellen had witnessed over the past 7 years. Every favor, every suppressed report, every case file that had gone quiet when Vale money was involved. He'd signed every page himself. By 2:15, I was sitting across from FBI Special Agent Dana Croft in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Asheville field office. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the careful attention of someone who'd spent her career listening for what people didn't say. She reviewed the USB contents on a department laptop while I walked her through the evidence chain, Sabine's recordings, the cabin camera footage, the box from Linden Ridge, and now Leonard's 12 years of financial architecture. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me. "We'll open a formal investigation," she said. "Wire fraud money, laundering obstruction, unlawful imprisonment. You'll be contacted for a formal statement." She paused. "You should know that Sheriff Pike was administratively suspended at 1:45 this afternoon." Orson hadn't fought it. He'd called his lawyer and gone home. Neela was waiting in the parking structure on the second level, leaning against the truck, with her arms crossed and her eyes scanning the street below out of old habit. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked when I reached her. I thought about that for a moment. The weight of the USB in my coat pocket, Dana Croft's careful, unreadable expression, Leonard Vail's flat eyes over a coffee cup on Haywood Street. "The investigation just started," I said. "But yeah, they can't hide anymore." Nyla exhaled slowly, tipping her head back against the truck window. My phone buzzed. "Allowin." I answered on the second ring. "I just got served divorce papers." Her voice was steady, frighteningly steady, the composure of someone who'd made up her mind about something. "From Lucian. He's trying to control the narrative one more time." I stared at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure. Somewhere below Asheville moved through its ordinary Thursday unaware that a family empire was beginning to come apart at every seam. "Let him try," I said. The courtroom smelled like old wood, and central heating pushed too hard against an October chill. I sat in the third row of the public gallery between Neela and an older man I didn't know who turned out to be a journalist from the Asheville Citizen-Times. The room filled slowly, attorneys with rolling carts, clerks sorting paper, a court reporter adjusting her machine. Ordinary sounds for an ordinary Tuesday morning, except that nothing about this morning was ordinary. Lucian Vail walked in at 9:02. He was wearing a navy suit, perfectly pressed, every line deliberate, and his hair was combed the same way it had been the morning I stood in his kitchen 6 weeks ago. He carried a leather portfolio. His attorney, a broad-shouldered man from Charlotte, walked half a step behind him, and Lucian was smiling. Not broadly, just the edges of his mouth, a controlled expression that said, "I am a reasonable man wrongly accused, and I have nothing to fear." I watched him find his seat. Then I looked across the aisle to where Elowen was already standing. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't looking at Lucian. She was looking straight ahead at the empty bench, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her back completely straight. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and her hair was pulled back clean. Simple, not designed to impress anyone. Her attorney, Claire Odom, sat beside her reviewing notes without urgency. Elowen didn't glance at Lucian once. Judge Marion Tate entered at 9:09 and the room rose. Elowen took the stand at 9:47. Claire Odom walked her through it methodically, dates, incidents, documentation. Elowen answered each question in a level voice, neither performing grief nor suppressing it. She described the first time Lucienne disconnected her phone without explanation. The week he removed her car from the driveway and told her she'd agreed to it. The evening he presented papers for her to sign explaining that her signature would protect Junie's future, and the way he stood in the doorway of the study for 45 minutes while she held the pen. "What happened when you didn't sign?" Claire asked. "He took Junie to his mother's for 4 days, Elowen said, and told me it was a vacation." The room was very quiet. "And the cabin on Linden Ridge, in your own words, can you describe your time there?" Elowen paused. Not from distress, I thought from precision. She wanted to get it right. "I was taken there on the morning of September 8th, she said. "I was told we were going to resolve things privately. When I refused to sign the trust transfer documents, the door was locked from the outside. I was given food twice a day. I was not allowed a phone. I was not told how long I would be there." She paused again. "I was there for 8 days." Lucian's attorney objected twice during her testimony. Judge Tate overruled both times without looking up from her notes. The camera footage played at 10:34. The screen on the courtroom's evidence monitor showed a fixed angle, a low corner of a stone basement wall, slightly tilted the way a camera looks when someone has adjusted it by feel in the dark. The timestamp read September 12th, 2024, 6:17 p.m. Lucian appeared on screen 14 seconds into the footage. He was carrying a manila folder. He set it on a small folding table, pulled a chair directly in front of where Elowen was sitting on the floor, and sat down. He spoke. The audio was partial. The room had poor acoustics, but 3 phrases came through. Clearly sign it tonight before she comes looking, and you don't want Junie to see you like this. Elowen on screen said nothing. She turned her face away. Lucian in the courtroom said nothing either. I watched his hands. He had them folded on top of the leather portfolio, and at some point I couldn't say exactly when he stopped moving entirely. Not stillness. Absence. The way a person looks when the version of themselves they've been maintaining has simply stepped out of the room and left the body behind. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Lucien didn't respond. I noticed Morel at 11:15 during a recess. She was seated 3 rows behind Lucian's side of the gallery, far enough to signal separation, close enough that she hadn't left. She was wearing a dark coat, her silver hair precisely arranged, and she was not looking at her son. She was looking at the man beside her own attorney, gray-suited, who was showing her something on a tablet. She studied it. Then she nodded once the nod of a woman approving a final draft. She glanced up once and found my eyes by accident. She looked away first. I thought about what Sabine had told me. She'll move to protect the family first and her son second. Watching Morel at that moment, I understood that by family, she'd always meant the empire. Lucien was a component that had malfunctioned. She wasn't saving him. She was ring-fencing the damage. Judge Tate read the decision at 2:48 p.m. The Harrow Vale Trust, $12.6 million established by Isolde Harrow and held by Aldrich Rowe, was confirmed as Elowen's sole inheritance under NC inheritance law, non-marital property not subject to equitable distribution. Elowen was granted primary physical and legal custody of Junie Vale. Lucian Vale was formally referred for criminal prosecution on charges of unlawful imprisonment, wire fraud, and coercion. The matter of the forged trust documents was referred to the federal level. In a separate proceeding that week, Morel Vale would face money laundering and conspiracy charges. Orson Pike would be indicted for obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. The details would come later: press releases, court dockets, names in the newspaper, the machinery of consequence grinding into motion. But right now, in this room at 2:48 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, what I heard was Elowen exhale. Not a gasp, not a sob, just a breath long and quiet and complete, the sound of something that had been held for a very long time, finally being set down. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She sat with her hands still folded on the table, and she breathed. The steps of the Buncombe County Courthouse caught afternoon light in a way that made the whole scene look briefly, improbably golden. Elowen pushed through the door first. Kellen held it behind her. Neela fell in beside me, and I came out last, blinking against the light. Junie was at the bottom of the steps. She was standing with Dr. Celine Armitage, a small, careful woman who had one hand on Junie's shoulder and was saying something to her. But Junie wasn't listening anymore. She'd seen her mother. She ran. Not carefully, not slowly, the way 8-year-olds run when they've been waiting for something so long that their whole body becomes the movement arms, legs, the small thud of sneakers on stone steps. Elowen dropped to her knees at the bottom and caught her daughter. I stopped walking and watched from 6 steps up. They held each other the way people do when they've rehearsed the reunion so many times in their heads that the real thing is almost too large to fit inside a moment. Elowen had her face buried in Junie's hair. Junie had both arms locked around her mother's neck. Then Junie looked up. She found me on the steps, standing alone, a little apart, the way I'd always stood in every photograph this family had ever taken. Her eyes were still wet, but she raised one small hand and waved. Just that. Just a wave. I raised my hand back. December came quietly to Harlan County. Not the way storms came, not with warning or drama, or the particular pressure drop that made the old cabin walls creak in protest, but the way things come when they've been patient long enough. One morning, the ridgeline was bare. The next, a thin white line had appeared along the top of the tree line, and by the time I noticed it from the porch, the first real snow was already falling. Soft, unhurried. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. I was sitting on the front steps with a cup of coffee I'd stopped pretending to drink when I heard the low engine note of a familiar car climbing the switchback below the cabin. I knew that sound now. I'd learned it sometime in the weeks between October's verdict and this morning, the particular way the tires caught gravel on the last turn before the clearing, the slight hesitation before the engine cut. I set my cup down on the step beside me. I didn't get up. I just waited. The car came around the bend and stopped in the clearing. Both doors opened at the same time. Junie hit the ground running. She crossed the distance in about 4 seconds sneakers, punching through the thin snow crust with complete disregard for anything underneath arms already open before she'd covered half the distance. She hit me somewhere around the sternum, small, solid, and entirely without hesitation, and the force of it pushed me back half a step against the porch rail. Grandma Z. Her voice was pressed into my coat. It snowed. It actually snowed. I wrapped both arms around her and closed my eyes, just for a second. Just one. It did, I said. I noticed. She pulled back far enough to look up at me, cheeks already going pink from the cold eyes wide and lit with the particular delight of a child who has decided that snow is proof the world occasionally gets things right. Can we go in the woods later? Nyla said there might be deer tracks if we look before dark. Nyla says a lot of things, I said. Most of them are true. I laughed the real kind, the kind that starts somewhere lower than your throat and doesn't ask permission. Most of them, I agreed. Alawan walked across the clearing more slowly. She was wearing a dark green coat I hadn't seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she moved through the thin snow without hurrying the walk of someone who had recently remembered that she was allowed to set her own pace. In the weeks since October, something in her had reorganized itself. She stood differently, occupied space differently, like a person who'd spent years making themselves smaller in a room and was only now cautiously allowing their full dimensions. She was looking at the cabin the way you look at a place you've heard described many times and are finally standing in front of. Her eyes moved across the porch, the stacked firewood, the wind chimes hanging from the eave, old copper ones, years of weather darkening them, and something in her expression settled the way a door settles into a frame after a long time warped. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said when she reached the steps. "It's enough," I said. She looked at me then directly without the old reflex of looking slightly past or away. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think it is." Inside, Nyla had already claimed the kitchen with the confidence of someone who considered cooking an active occupation. The sounds reached us before we opened the door. The particular clatter of cast iron, the soft thud of a cutting board, and the smell of something warm and spiced was already moving through the cabin, like a second kind of warmth. Junie went straight to Nyla. I heard her voice immediately. "Can I stir it? I've been practicing. I'm very careful now." And Nyla's response short and amused and already yielding. Alawan stood in the center of the front room and looked around. I watched her take it in slowly, the shelves of worn field guides and ranger manuals, the topographic maps still pinned above the desk with their red ink markings, the fireplace burning low and steady. And then her eyes found the wooden box on the upper shelf, set back where the light didn't quite reach it. She went still. "Is that?" she started. "Yes." She turned to me. "Can I? It was always meant for you." She brought the box to the table by the window and sat with it the way you sit with something you've been circling for a long time, carefully giving it room. I sat across from her and said nothing. She lifted the lid. The lavender smell came first. Faint after all these years, but still present, caught deep in the fibers of the folded wedding dress on top. Elewyn touched the edge of the fabric with 2 fingers, just the hem, just barely, and didn't speak. Beneath it, a folded letter in handwriting she recognized. Before she'd processed the recognition, a cassette tape with a date written in faded marker and 2 land documents signed in the same careful hand at the bottom. She unfolded the letter. I watched her read it. I watched the exact moment she reached the line I knew was there. Zariah Quinn will protect my daughter better than anyone because she is the only one who loves without wanting anything in return. Because her breath changed. Not dramatically, just a small catch, barely audible, the sound of something landing. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold. She sat with the letter open in her lap for a long time, the snow coming down outside the window, the fire moving quietly in the grate. Then she looked up. Why didn't you ever tell me about what she left you, about all of it? Because you needed to find it yourself, I said, not be told. She held my gaze. Outside, the snow had deepened its quiet. In the kitchen, Junie was explaining something to Nyla with great seriousness, and Nyla was making the specific sound of someone performing more astonishment than they felt, the ordinary sounds of a house that had people in it. Elewyn set the letter down with both hands, very carefully the way you set down something irreplaceable. Then she stood up. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her arms around me. No preamble, no explanation, just her arms and the breath of someone setting down a weight they'd carried so long they'd stopped noticing it had a shape. I brought my hands up and held on, and I thought about all the versions of this moment I had never let myself imagine because imagining it had felt like asking for too much. We stood there. The fire shifted. Junie laughed at something in the kitchen. The snow fell. Then very quietly, so close I felt it, before I heard it, she said one word. Mom. I didn't cry right away. I stood completely still with my hands pressed against her back, and I let the word exist. Let it fill every corner of the space it had always been owed. I thought about Isolde's map folded into a wooden box, about a phone call at 11:47 on a Friday night from a child who knew something was wrong, because the voice said the right words but not the right way. About 22 years of a door that was never quite closed and never quite open. This is what I was waiting for, I thought. I just didn't know how to name it. Junie appeared in the doorway approximately 40 seconds later and declared that we were wasting the snow. So we went outside, all 4 of us, into the clearing behind the cabin where the snow was coming down in earnest, now soft and continuous, the kind that muffles everything and makes the world feel briefly, generously hushed. Junie spun with her arms out, face tipped up, catching snowflakes on her tongue. Nayla was examining the ground near the tree line with the focused interest of someone half expecting to find those deer tracks she'd promised. Elewyn stood close enough that our shoulders touched both of us, watching Junie move through the snow like she owned it. Above us, the Appalachian sky was pale gray-white, the deep winter color that makes everything beneath it feel both very small and carefully held. I looked up at it for a long moment. Isolde, I thought. I kept my promise. The snow kept falling, quiet and patient, the way things come when they've waited long enough. Someone once asked me if I regretted any of it, the years of silence, the distance, the waiting. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I don't believe things happen by accident. I believe there's a design we can't always read from where we're standing, and that sometimes God places the right person at the right door, not because the timing is convenient, but because the work required someone willing to show up anyway. I was that person for Elewyn. Elewyn was that person for Junie. And Junie at 8 years old on a Friday night was that person for all of us. This is a story about family betrayal, about how the people closest to us can quietly dismantle everything we are one small silence at a time. It's about family revenge, not the kind with fire and fury, but the quieter kind. The truth told plainly in a room that cannot look away. And it's about what survives family betrayal when one person refuses to let it be the final word. If there's anything I'd ask you to take from my story, it's this. Don't do what I did. Don't wait 22 years to knock on the door. Don't let someone else's lie about who you are become the story you live inside. Speak sooner. Show up earlier. The people worth fighting for are worth the discomfort of being wrong. Family revenge is never really about settling scores. It's about refusing to disappear. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't already, subscribe. The stories ahead will find you when you're ready. Thank you for staying until the end. A note before you go. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of reflection and storytelling. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.